Catherine, called Cat by her neighbours, awoke with a strange sense of heaviness. At 49, she had always been the heart of the village. Friendly, generous, a mother figure to the children. But something was off this morning. A pressure in her chest, a weariness that crept deeper with every passing hour. At first it was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the slow draining of a well. She smiled at the children as they ran past her house, but her eyes betrayed her. A dullness that wasn't there before. In the days of the Vikings, it was said that the soul's thread could be clipped too early, the Norns pulling it out of time. Some believed it wasn't death that claimed the body first, but rather a slow draining of the soul, a force of the unseen that weakened the spirit bit by bit. But Cat did not know this. She only felt the strange emptiness, the sudden loss of warmth. It wasn't death, it was something more insidious, a slow corruption of her life force. By the time evening settled in, she found herself staring at the fire, too tired to tend to it. Her body, normally lively and full of purpose, now felt foreign. The shadows of her small cottage grew long, oppressive, and she couldn't shake the gnawing sense that something was waiting for her to fade. The day ended, but it didn't feel like night. It felt like a pause, a breath before something deeper, darker began. Cat could not rise from her bed on the second day. Her limbs felt as if they were made of stone. The once vibrant skin of her hands was pale, almost translucent, the veins visible beneath the surface. A dull ache pulsed in her chest, as though her heart were no longer beating of its own accord. Her breath came shallow and every movement felt heavy, as though gravity itself had become a cruel force. The neighbours, the few who still ventured close, began to whisper. The Vikings believed in a slow descent into death, a process called where the spirit's strength faltered and the body began to rot while the soul lingered, trapped between two realms. Cat had always been the one to help others, but today there was no one who could help her. Her laughter, once warm and inviting, now felt like an echo from a distant past. Her husband, Thomas, had never seen her like this. She had never fallen ill for long, and now he could see the change. The fear, the unease in her eyes seemed to grow with each passing moment. By dusk, she could no longer sit up in bed. Her voice, usually so strong, was reduced to a hoarse whisper as she muttered something incomprehensible, maybe an old prayer or a plea for release. Her neighbours, out of fear, stayed away. In hushed voices, some spoke of the spirits of the forest that claimed the souls of the dying, weaving a web of misery around them until they disappeared into the trees, never to return. Would Cat, in her weakened state, fall prey to such forces? The third day saw Cat's body wasting even further. Her skin was taut, stretched thin across her bones, and her breathing grew shallow and erratic. Her once bright green eyes were clouded over, pupils dilated unnaturally. Her tongue swelled in her mouth, making it impossible to speak, and she could no longer sit upright. It was said that devil worshippers of old could channel the unholy power that could corrupt the dying and drain their strength until their soul was ripe for possession. Some believed the devil himself lingered near the dying, offering a final cruel bargain to the desperate. Was Cat making such a bargain now, as her life force dwindled away? No one knew, but her eyes, now a shade of green that could barely be called life, were wide open and staring into nothing. Her neighbours, terrified, began leaving food outside her door, but no one dared enter. There was something about her now, a malevolent presence that could be felt even through the thick walls of her cottage. They did not know what to do, for Cat was still breathing, but it seemed as if she no longer inhabited her own body. Nightfall brought a strange, cold stillness. The wind didn't move, the forest stood silent, but in the quiet something else stirred. something that wasn't quite human. By day 4, Cat's body no longer resembled the woman she once was. Her bones jutted out, her skin hanging loosely from her skeletal frame. Her breathing had slowed to a near halt, and her pulse was barely a whisper. Yet there was something about her, something that didn't feel like a body dying. It felt like something waiting to emerge. The ancient Norse believed that the dying could become revenants, undead creatures that roamed the earth after death. The Draugr were feared not only for their ability to spread disease and misfortune, but for their power to suck the life force from the living. Cat's neighbours began to fear that she was no longer human. Her soul was slipping away, but what was left behind might not be her at all. In the night, Thomas awoke to a sound, a scraping at the window. He glanced over, expecting to see Cat's feeble attempt to rise, but there was only stillness. Yet there was something wrong with the room, something unsettling in the air. A flickering shadow, a shape that didn't belong. No one dared speak it aloud, but every neighbour now feared that the spirit was growing stronger, feeding on Cat's vitality. The spirit that would soon break free from the prison of her body. The 5th day saw Cat's body deteriorating at an alarming rate. Her skin had taken on an almost translucent quality, and her eyes, those green eyes, had now become a dull, sickly yellow, pulsing faintly, as if something inside her was alive, but not entirely. Her chest rose and fell erratically, but it seemed that each breath was a struggle. Some began to speak of ancient rites, dark rites used by those who followed the old ways, by those who worshipped the devil in secret. They spoke of the trickster god who could steal life from the living, and the ritual where the dead were forced to return to the land of the living in some twisted demonic form. Cat's condition mirrored these old legends, her body deteriorating, her spirit slipping further from this world, but something darker beginning to manifest. By night a chill descended upon her house. Thomas could feel it, creeping under the door, freezing the air around him. He would not sleep, not tonight. Cat's mutterings grew louder, unintelligible whispers that seemed to come from all corners of the room. But when he turned, she was still, her body unmoving. The 6th day came, and it felt as though Cat's body had been abandoned entirely. Her skin was so pale now, it was like marble. Her eyes were open wide, but there was no life in them. Her mouth hung slightly open, as though frozen in time. The space around her felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, but there was no evidence of anything physical decaying. It was only her spirit that had begun to rot. Her neighbours, now frantic with fear, spoke of ancient rituals to ward off the dead. The Vikings had long believed in the scurrilous who could commune with spirits and guide the dead to their final resting places. Would it have been able to stop this slow corruption, or was it already too late? By dusk, Cat's body seemed to shrink, the energy draining from it like the last flicker of a flame. But there was no death yet, only a strange, unnatural silence. The room around her grew darker. Cat's transformation reached its apex on day 7. Her body was now a near skeleton, her once gorgeous hair a mass of brittle grey strands. Her face had collapsed inward, her jaw hanging slack. Her eyes, now completely clouded over, were wide open, but vacant. Her breath had stopped entirely. Some of the more superstitious villagers now believed that Cat had crossed over. She had entered the realm of the dark elves, who were said to claim the spirits of the dead, twisting them into creatures of shadow and malice. It was as if Cat was no longer the woman they knew. She had crossed a line, and her soul had gone somewhere else, somewhere dark, far beyond their understanding. That night the wind howled. A distant cry, almost like a wail, echoed from the depths of the forest. On day 8, Cat's body seemed to finally give in to whatever dark force had overtaken her. She was now a husk, an empty shell, but her spirit lingered. Her presence could still be felt in the house, a strange pressure that made the air thick and oppressive. The neighbours, watching from their windows, saw dark shapes moving in the corners of the house, though no one was inside. Her transformation into something had begun. Those who had witnessed death before now spoke in hushed tones of a black magician who could invoke the dead into a new form. Was this the beginning of that process? Was she becoming something beyond the grave? Nightfall came, and the forest seemed to whisper. The 9th day arrived, and Cat was no longer the woman who had once lived in that small house. Her body, now nothing but bone and withered flesh, was abandoned. What remained was something far darker, something that had no name. Neighbours spoke of seeing a black cat with glowing, pulsing green eyes darting from the house in the dead of night. It was emaciated, its fur slick and matted, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural, malevolent energy. It fled into the nearby forest, disappearing among the trees. And from that night onward, those who ventured too close to the forest would swear they saw a pair of glowing green eyes watching from the shadows. The spirit of Cat had left her body and become something else, something that would haunt the living for eternity.